Sometimes the smallest object in a prison camp carries the heaviest truth. Southern Germany, May 1945. The war had ended on paper, but silence still ruled the temporary American processing camp built inside the grounds of an abandoned military academy. Rows of olive-drab tents stood beneath tall oak trees that had somehow survived years of uncertainty. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth, fresh coffee, and canvas still wet from the night's light rain. Trucks came and went through the front gate. Clerks sorted documents on folding tables. Guards checked names, counted supplies, and followed routines that made long days pass a little faster. Among the hundreds of civilians waiting for interviews and relocation orders was a young German woman named Anna Keller. She was 23 years old, fair-skinned, with ash-blonde hair tied neatly beneath a faded gray scarf. She spoke only when spoken to. She never pushed forward in line. She never complained about the cold mornings or the endless waiting. Every afternoon, when the shadows stretched across the gravel yard, she sat alone on a weathered wooden bench near the old stone well with a small notebook resting quietly in her lap. It was nothing remarkable to anyone passing by. Its brown cover had faded from years of use. The corners were bent. A simple cloth ribbon held the pages together. Some assumed it was a diary. Others guessed it was a prayer book without a cover. A few soldiers joked that she was probably writing poems about going home. Anna never corrected anyone. She simply opened the notebook for a few minutes, wrote carefully with the same short pencil, closed it again, and returned it to the inside pocket of her worn coat as though it belonged nowhere else in the world. Captain Daniel Brooks noticed her on the third morning. 36 years old and raised on a farm outside Des Moines, Iowa, Brooks had spent months processing displaced civilians after the fighting stopped. Experience had taught him that people often carried the only things they had left: wedding photographs folded into wallets, children's drawings tucked inside jackets, rusted keys to houses that no longer existed, a silver watch that no longer ticked. The notebook seemed no different. He watched Anna from across the yard while signing transport papers. She never looked around to see who might be watching. She never hid the notebook. Yet she protected it with quiet determination that somehow drew more attention than fear ever could. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in the camp had noticed the young German woman with the little brown notebook. No one imagined that inside those worn pages rested something capable of stopping an entire camp in perfect silence before a single word was spoken. Captain Daniel Brooks had learned that routine often revealed more than interrogation ever could. Every morning he walked the same gravel path between the administration tent and the supply depot with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm, greeting the same guards, checking the same inventory sheets, and listening to the familiar rhythm of camp life settle into place. Engines rumbled in the distance. Tin cups clinked against wooden tables. Somewhere a radio played soft swing music from an American station strong enough to reach across the countryside. Yet each afternoon, almost without realizing it, his eyes drifted toward the weathered bench beside the old stone well. Anna Keller was always there. She never arrived early. She never stayed late. Her movements were measured, almost as though she carried an invisible clock that no one else could hear. She would sit quietly, smooth the front of her worn coat, remove the small notebook from the inside pocket, and begin writing with careful, deliberate strokes. She never hurried. She never erased a line. When she finished, she closed the cover with both hands, paused for a moment, and looked across the camp toward the rolling hills beyond the fence before slipping it safely away again. Brooks found himself wondering what could possibly require such discipline after everything Europe had endured. One afternoon he stopped beside Sergeant Thomas Reed, a former schoolteacher from Indiana who now supervised civilian registration. Reed glanced toward Anna and smiled. "She has been doing that every day since she arrived," he said. One of the guards asked if she was keeping track of the weather. Brooks looked again. Did she answer? Reed shook his head. She simply smiled and kept writing. There was nothing suspicious about the exchange, yet the silence around the notebook seemed to grow larger with every passing day. Curiosity spread through the camp in quiet ways. A cook claimed she might be recording family recipes she hoped to make again someday. A medic guessed she was listing the names of relatives still missing. A young private joked that perhaps she was writing a novel about impatient American officers. The laughter faded quickly because no one had ever seen Anna laugh at the joke or react at all. She remained exactly the same, calm without appearing distant, courteous without inviting conversation. That consistency intrigued Brooks more than any dramatic display could have. Late on Friday afternoon, a steady breeze swept across the camp, carrying the scent of pine and freshly cut grass. Several loose papers blew from a clerk's table, sending two soldiers running after them. Anna instinctively reached down to hold her notebook against her lap before the wind could touch it. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, yet Brooks noticed the care with which her fingers rested on the worn cover. It was not fear of losing an object. It looked more like respect for something that had earned its place beside her. As evening approached, Brooks signed the final transport report of the day when a military intelligence officer stepped into the administration tent with a sealed folder under his arm. The officer quietly explained that all personal writings belonging to newly processed civilians would undergo a standard review before relocation. Brooks nodded without concern. It sounded like another ordinary procedure among hundreds already completed. Neither man realized that before the next sunset, one ordinary notebook would become the only subject anyone in the camp could think about. The following morning arrived wrapped in low gray clouds that softened the sunlight and left tiny drops of moisture clinging to every canvas tent. Camp routines unfolded as they always had. Breakfast was served just after sunrise. Registration lines formed outside the administration building. Trucks loaded with supplies rolled through the front gate, while mechanics tightened loose bolts beneath their hoods. Nothing suggested that the day would become different from the dozens before it. Shortly before noon, Sergeant Thomas Reed approached Anna with quiet professionalism. He removed his cap, offered a polite nod, and explained that military regulations required a temporary review of all personal written materials before civilian relocation. His voice was calm, almost apologetic. Anna listened without interrupting. She looked toward the old stone well for only a moment before reaching inside her coat. Without hesitation, she placed the notebook into his waiting hands. There was no argument, no request to keep it, no visible disappointment. She simply said, "Please handle it carefully." Her English carried a gentle accent, yet every word was clear. Reed promised that it would be returned as soon as the review was complete. As he walked away, he noticed that the notebook felt unexpectedly heavy for its size. The cover had been repaired more than once with neat stitching along the spine. Several pages were reinforced with narrow strips of cloth instead of tape. Whoever had cared for it had expected it to survive years rather than weeks. Reed carried it directly to Captain Daniel Brooks, who was reviewing transport schedules inside the administration tent. Brooks accepted the notebook with little concern. "Another diary?" he asked while signing a stack of forms. Reed shrugged. "Probably, but she asked that we handle it carefully." Brooks placed the notebook on the corner of his desk beside a metal coffee cup that had long since gone cold. Around him, typewriters clicked steadily as clerks prepared relocation records. Maps covered one wall of the tent. Filing cabinets stood open, filled with names from every corner of Europe. The notebook seemed insignificant among so many official documents. Lieutenant Richard Collins from Military Intelligence arrived a few minutes later carrying the sealed authorization folder from headquarters. Collins was younger than Brooks by nearly a decade and possessed the confidence of someone who believed every mystery could be solved with enough paperwork. He glanced at the worn notebook and smiled faintly. "Perhaps we will discover a collection of poetry," he joked. One clerk quietly laughed before returning to his typing. Brooks offered no reply. Something about the notebook discouraged easy humor. Collins sat down across the desk and carefully untied the faded cloth ribbon that held the cover closed. Dust rose softly into the morning light, filtering through the canvas roof. The room seemed oddly still. Outside, distant voices drifted across the yard, but inside the administration tent the only sound came from pages brushing gently against one another. Brooks expected sentimental memories, personal reflections, perhaps names of family members separated by the war. Instead, even before Collins reached the second page, his expression changed. The relaxed smile disappeared without a word. His shoulders straightened. He leaned closer, reading each line with growing concentration. Brooks noticed the shift immediately. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Collins did not answer. He slowly turned another page, then another, his fingertips moving with unusual care, as though afraid even the slightest movement might disturb whatever rested before him. Captain Daniel Brooks stepped around the desk until he stood beside Lieutenant Richard Collins. Without speaking, he lowered his eyes to the first open page. The handwriting was remarkably precise, each letter carefully formed in dark pencil that had faded only slightly with time. There were no personal reflections, no complaints, no emotional confessions. Every page followed the same disciplined structure. A full date, a location, a list of names, short observations, tiny sketches of roads, churches, schoolhouses, and barns. Brooks turned another page, then another. The pattern continued with astonishing consistency. One entry identified an elderly physician who had continued treating children after the local clinic closed. Another listed the names of orphaned brothers who had been moved from one village to another before winter arrived. Several pages recorded the locations of temporary shelters established inside churches and town halls. Others identified wells that still produced clean drinking water when nearby pumps had failed. Everything was written without judgment, without politics, without anger. It was simply a careful record of people and places, preserved with extraordinary discipline. Collins quietly reached for a folded military map lying on the corner of the desk. He compared one hand-drawn sketch from the notebook with the printed roads shown on the official map. The curves matched. Even a narrow footbridge crossing a small creek appeared in exactly the same place. Brooks frowned slightly. How could she know all of this? Collins did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued reading until he reached another section marked by a simple line drawn across the page. Below it appeared dozens of names followed by brief notes. Family reunited. Child transferred safely. Teacher relocated. Elderly couple remained together. Red Cross notified. Every sentence was short, almost clinical, yet together they revealed months of patient observation. Nothing suggested military value. Everything suggested compassion organized with remarkable precision. Sergeant Thomas Reed stepped quietly into the tent carrying another stack of transport requests. He stopped when he noticed the unusual silence. Usually the administration office echoed with typewriters, conversations, and footsteps. Now every clerk seemed distracted, watching Brooks and Collins without saying a word. Reed placed the papers on the nearest table, but no one reached for them. Collins carefully turned another page. Tucked between two sheets rested a pressed wildflower, flattened so gently that its pale petals remained almost perfect. Brooks expected the next page to contain a personal memory explaining its presence. Instead, beneath the flower appeared another detailed list. This one identified volunteer nurses, local pastors, school teachers, and farmers who had quietly opened their homes to displaced families during the final months of uncertainty. Besides several names, Anna had written one simple phrase: trusted by children. Brooks slowly removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He had processed thousands of reports during the past year, most focused on supply routes, damaged buildings, transportation schedules, or official directives. This notebook documented something entirely different. It recorded ordinary acts of humanity that no military office had ever considered important enough to preserve. Collins finally broke the silence. This is not a diary. His voice was almost a whisper. Brooks nodded without taking his eyes from the pages. No, he answered quietly. Someone spent years building a living record. Outside, another truck rolled through the camp gate, its engine echoing across the gravel yard. Inside the administration tent, no one moved. The notebook remained open beneath the morning light, and for the first time since the camp had been established, official paperwork no longer seemed like the most important documents in the room. Before Captain Daniel Brooks closed the notebook, his attention settled on a page unlike the others. There was no sketch, no map, and no list of locations. Instead, the page contained two carefully arranged columns of names. The heading above them reads simply, "Confirmed together." Beneath it, husbands and wives appeared side by side, parents beside children, brothers beside sisters. Next to every family, Anna had written the date when she had last seen them together before they were transferred, relocated, or evacuated. Some entries ended with a single sentence: still traveling together. Others read, separated during transport. Several carried one quiet word: found. Brooks looked toward Collins without speaking. Collins understood immediately. These were not military records. They were attempts to preserve families before confusion erased them forever. Collins carefully compared one name from the notebook against a recently completed civilian registration file sitting in a nearby cabinet. He opened the drawer, removed the folder, and scanned the typed pages. The same surname appeared. The same hometown. Even the age matched. Collins frowned, then checked another name. Again, everything aligned. Reed watched from across the room as Collins continued comparing records. One after another, every detail matched official documents that Anna should never have seen after arriving at the camp. The precision was astonishing, yet there was nothing mysterious about it. She had simply observed, remembered, and written everything with extraordinary care long before those records reached American hands. Brooks slowly turned another page. Here the handwriting became slightly smaller, as though Anna had been trying to fit more information onto every sheet. Local teachers willing to reopen classrooms. Bakers who still possessed working ovens. Carpenters able to repair damaged roofs. Midwives trusted by neighboring villages. Blacksmiths whose workshops remained standing. She had quietly documented not only who survived, but who could help others begin again. Brooks rested one hand against the desk. She was not recording the past, he said softly. She was preserving the future. No one answered because no one could improve upon the thought. Outside the administration tent, the afternoon continued exactly as before. Soldiers unloaded wooden crates. A mechanic laughed with another driver while tightening the wheel of a transport truck. Somewhere beyond the fence, birds settled into the branches of the old oaks as though the countryside itself had already decided peace was finally possible. Inside the tent, however, time seemed to move more slowly. Lieutenant Collins reached the final pages. They were almost blank except for several carefully folded slips of paper tucked between the sheets. Brooks unfolded the first one. It contained only an address and the name of a little girl whose parents had asked strangers to remember where she had relatives in another town. A second slip listed the location of an elderly couple unable to travel without assistance. A third held nothing except a child's drawing of a small farmhouse with smoke rising gently from its chimney. Someone had written beneath it, "Home, when we find it again." Brooks quietly folded the drawing and returned it exactly where he had found it. He realized then that the notebook had never belonged to Anna alone. Dozens of frightened people had entrusted pieces of their hope to its pages because they believed she would protect them. She had accepted that responsibility without recognition, without authority, and without expecting anyone to notice. Brooks closed the cover with both hands, taking the same care Anna had shown every afternoon beside the old stone well. When the cloth ribbon settled back into place, no one in the administration tent reached for another file. The paperwork could wait. For several long moments, every person in the room sat in complete silence, not because regulations required it, but because respect did. Late that afternoon, Captain Daniel Brooks carried the notebook himself across the camp instead of sending a messenger. The gravel path crunched softly beneath his boots as the breeze stirred the canvas walls of the tents. The familiar sounds of the camp had returned. Clerks sorted paperwork. Cooks prepared the evening meal. A pair of mechanics laughed while wiping grease from their hands. Everything appeared ordinary again. Yet Brooks felt as though he had been entrusted with something far more valuable than another official document. Anna Keller remained on the weathered bench beside the old stone well where she had sat every afternoon since arriving. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. She looked toward the distant hills glowing beneath the late afternoon sun, as though measuring time by the changing light instead of the camp schedule. When Brooks approached, she rose politely but said nothing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Brooks held the notebook carefully with both hands before offering it back to her. Anna accepted it with the same quiet respect she had shown every day. She ran her fingertips lightly across the worn cover, checking that the cloth ribbon remained tied exactly as before. Only then did she look up. "Thank you," she said softly. Brooks hesitated before asking the question that had occupied his thoughts all afternoon. "When did you begin writing?" Anna lowered her eyes to the notebook for a moment. "Autumn of 1943, she answered. "At first, it was only names." Brooks listened without interrupting. "People were leaving every week," she continued. "Children, teachers, elderly couples, nurses, families searching for relatives. Everyone feared they would disappear from one another forever. They asked me to remember where they had gone. I was good at writing clearly, so I wrote everything down. She smiled faintly, though there was sadness behind it. After a while, strangers began asking me too. Brooks glanced toward the notebook. You never intended it to become a record of the war. Anna gently shook her head. No, wars already have enough records. Generals write reports. Governments keep archives. Newspapers print headlines. She paused as a small flock of birds crossed the evening sky overhead. But ordinary people disappear very easily unless someone remembers them. Brooks remained silent. The words settled over the quiet camp with unexpected weight. Anna slowly opened the notebook and turned several pages. She pointed to one name written near the top of a list. She was a music teacher. She worried that her students would think she had abandoned them. Another page revealed the name of an elderly baker. He wanted someone to know where his wife had been taken so they could find each other again. She turned another page. This little boy carried a wooden toy horse everywhere. I promised his mother I would remember the address of her sister if they became separated. Brooks realized that every page represented a promise rather than a report. Every carefully written line reflected trust placed in one quiet young woman who had never possessed rank, authority, or official responsibility. She had simply refused to let people become forgotten. The evening sun slipped lower behind the hills, bathing the old stone well in warm golden light. Brooks removed his cap without thinking, holding it at his side as Anna carefully closed the notebook once more. He understood then why she had guarded it so faithfully. It did not belong to history alone. It belonged to every voice that had been too small to appear in official records, and somehow, through patience instead of power, she had preserved them all. The conversation beside the old stone well remained with Captain Daniel Brooks long after the evening bell signaled the end of the day's duties. As darkness settled across the camp, he returned to the administration office instead of his quarters. A single desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across maps, registration files, and stacks of transport documents waiting to be signed. Brooks sat quietly for several minutes before opening one of the civilian folders that had arrived earlier that week. He searched for a familiar surname from Anna's notebook. It appeared exactly where she had written it, attached to a family now scheduled for relocation within days. He checked another, then another. Every comparison strengthened the same conclusion. Her careful observations could help officials reunite people more quickly and reduce mistakes during the enormous task of rebuilding ordinary lives. The following morning, Brooks requested permission to make handwritten copies of selected pages with Anna's approval. She listened carefully as he explained his idea. There was no excitement in her expression, only thoughtful consideration. The notebook should stay with me, she said gently. But if the names can help someone find home again, then you may copy what is needed. Brooks nodded immediately. The notebook never leaves your possession again. That promise mattered to her more than any official order. For the next several afternoons, an unusual routine quietly developed inside the administration tent. Anna sat at one end of a long wooden table with her notebook open before her. Brooks, Sergeant Thomas Reed, and Lieutenant Richard Collins sat across from her with blank forms, pencils, and official maps. Anna never hurried. She read each entry exactly as she had written it, spelling every surname with patient precision. When a village had two churches, she identified which one stood beside the river. When two families shared the same last name, she described the color of the front door or the orchard beside the farmhouse so there would be no confusion. Brooks noticed details that no military report had ever considered important becoming unexpectedly valuable. A carpenter remembered for repairing children's desks. A widow known for baking bread every Sunday. A schoolhouse with a large chestnut tree visible from the road. Those simple descriptions allowed officials to distinguish one location from another with surprising accuracy. Within a week, the copied information had already answered several unanswered questions in the registration office. A grandmother searching for her daughter learned the correct relocation center because Anna had written the name of the nearby mill instead of only the village. A young boy recognized the drawing of a small chapel and confirmed that it stood beside the farm where his uncle still lived. Even experienced clerks began asking whether Miss Keller's notebook contained information that might clarify uncertain records. Brooks noticed something else changing as well. Soldiers who had once walked past Anna without a second glance now greeted her with quiet respect. No speeches were given. No special privileges appeared. The change revealed itself in small moments. Someone carried an extra chair to her table before she arrived. A fresh pencil quietly replaced the worn one she had been using for months. The camp librarian offered her a clean sheet of blotting paper to protect the fragile pages. None of those gestures had been ordered. They simply happened. Brooks realized that respect rarely announced itself with grand ceremonies. More often, it arrived through ordinary kindness shown without expecting recognition. Watching Anna continue her careful work with the same calm patience she had always possessed, he understood that the notebook had not changed who she was. It had only revealed a character that had been quietly present from the very beginning. Nearly 3 weeks passed before the first letters began returning to the camp. They arrived in ordinary envelopes carried inside canvas mailbags that had become part of the daily routine. Most contained routine military correspondence, transport confirmations, and supply requests. A few, however, were addressed directly to Captain Daniel Brooks. Each one referred to information that had originated from Anna Keller's notebook. One letter came from a relief office that had successfully reunited an elderly couple after recognizing the description of a small flour mill Anna had recorded beside their village. Another confirmed that 2 sisters separated during evacuation had been located because the notebook identified the exact church where they had last been seen together. Brooks placed every letter inside a single folder without saying much about them, but word quietly spread through the administration office. The notebook was no longer viewed as an interesting discovery. It had become a practical tool that restored certainty where confusion had once existed. Anna never asked about the results. Every afternoon, she continued sitting at the same wooden table, patiently answering questions whenever someone needed clarification. Sometimes she corrected the spelling of a surname. Sometimes she remembered the color of a farmhouse roof or the direction of a narrow lane leading toward an orchard. Her memory seemed remarkable, yet Brooks gradually understood it came from careful attention rather than extraordinary talent. She had simply listened when others spoke because she believed every detail mattered to the person sharing it. One cool morning, a representative from a humanitarian relief organization visited the camp to review civilian registration records. Brooks quietly placed the copied pages from Anna's notebook beside the official files. The visitor spent nearly an hour comparing the information before looking up with genuine surprise. "Who prepared these supplemental records?" he asked. Brooks glanced across the room, where Anna sat quietly repairing the loose stitching along the notebook's spine with a needle and dark thread. "She did," he answered simply. The visitor watched her for a long moment before walking over. He thanked Anna for preserving information that otherwise might have disappeared forever. She accepted the gratitude with a gentle smile and replied, "The families trusted me. I only tried to keep my promise." There was no pride in her voice, only quiet honesty. Later that afternoon, Brooks noticed something that stayed with him long afterward. A young private delivering fresh office supplies paused beside Anna's table. Instead of placing the pencils and paper down carelessly as he had done countless times before, he arranged them neatly within her reach and wished her a pleasant afternoon. She thanked him by name because she had remembered it from an earlier conversation. The private walked away smiling without realizing why the small exchange felt different. Respect had become part of the camp's atmosphere. It appeared in lowered voices, patient conversations, and thoughtful gestures too ordinary to attract attention, yet impossible to overlook once they existed. As the sun drifted lower across the western hills, Brooks stepped outside the administration building and watched long shadows stretch across the gravel yard. Weeks earlier, he had believed leadership depended upon orders, regulations, and careful organization. Anna had shown him another kind of leadership entirely. She had never commanded anyone. She had never asked to be noticed. She had simply carried other people's stories with unwavering care until someone finally understood their value. Standing beneath the quiet evening sky, Brooks realized that history often remembered those who changed maps, but communities survived because someone had taken the time to remember names. By the end of the summer, the temporary processing camp had grown noticeably quieter. Long registration lines became shorter with each passing week as more families departed for new homes and new beginnings. Trucks that had once arrived filled with uncertainty now left carrying furniture, suitcases, blankets, and children waving through open windows. The camp itself slowly transformed from a place of waiting into a place of departure. Captain Daniel Brooks stood near the front gate one cool September morning, reviewing the final relocation orders for another group of civilians. Near the bottom of the list, he found a familiar name, Anna Keller. Her destination was a small town where relatives had recently been located through relief agencies. Brooks folded the papers carefully before walking toward the old stone well one last time. Anna was already there. The familiar notebook rested quietly in her hands, its cloth ribbon tied neatly around the worn cover. Some things, he realized, had never changed. She still sat with the same calm posture. She still watched the distant hills before writing a few careful lines. The difference was not in her. It was in everyone who had learned to see her. Brooks stopped beside the bench and held out the travel documents. "Everything is ready, Miss Keller," he said. It was the first time he had addressed her by name in front of others instead of referring to her as another civilian awaiting transport. Anna accepted the papers with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Captain Brooks." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The morning breeze stirred the leaves above the old well, scattering small patches of sunlight across the gravel. Brooks finally removed his cap, not because military custom required it, but because respect often found its own language. "There is one more thing," he said quietly. From inside a leather portfolio, he removed a neatly bound folder containing the handwritten copies that had been created from her notebook over the previous weeks. "These copies will remain with the relief offices. Your notebook remains yours alone." Anna looked down at the folder, then back at the familiar notebook resting safely in her hands. She nodded once. That is how it should be. Before boarding the transport truck, she opened the notebook one final time. Brooks expected her to write another location or another name. Instead, she carefully turned to the last blank page. With slow, deliberate handwriting, she wrote a single sentence. When she finished, she gently tore out the page, folded it once, and handed it to Brooks. After the truck disappeared beyond the gate, he unfolded the paper. It read, "If people remember one another, no journey is ever completely lost." Brooks carried those words home to Iowa after his military service ended. Years later, whenever neighbors asked about the war, he rarely spoke about strategies, uniforms, or official reports. Instead, he remembered one quiet young woman who believed ordinary lives deserved to be remembered with extraordinary care. The copied records continued helping relief organizations long after the camp itself had been dismantled. Families found relatives. Children discovered forgotten addresses. Small communities rebuilt connections that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Anna Keller never appeared in newspapers. No ceremony celebrated the notebook she had protected so faithfully. Yet its pages quietly fulfilled the purpose she had imagined from the very beginning. History often preserves the names of those who command armies or sign treaties. Far more quietly, it is also shaped by those who choose to remember strangers when no one is watching. She never carried authority. She carried responsibility. She never tried to change history. She simply refused to let humanity be forgotten. And in the end, that small notebook became proof that the quietest people are often the ones who leave the deepest mark.